Hi, everyone. This is S.J. Thomason, and I'm here with two awesome lady apologists, Lisa Q and Lori M. We'll just call her Lisa and Lori. And so I'm with two amazing women who practice apologetics. They're part of, at least Lisa's part of Women in Apologetics, and I'm really excited about that. And so, am I hearing a background noise? What I want to do right now is introduce them, Lisa and Lori, and we're going to talk today a little bit about women in apologetics. Kind of, it's a rarity that women are in apologetics, why it's a rarity, and we're going to talk a little bit about objective morality and how people can understand what that means, because there seems to be some confusion, definitely online and social media. I've noticed that some people don't seem to grasp this idea of objective morality. And so before further ado, let me shift over to Lisa, and then we'll go to Lori, and we're gonna share some of our perspectives.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me on again, SJ. Really is a pleasure and an honor, and I enjoy it very much. So I am the Vice Chair of Women in Apologetics, and it's a ministry that highlights women that are in the field of apologetics. And we're actually having a national conference coming up at the end of this month, the 24th and 25th of January at Biola University in La Mirada, California, where the weather is better than where I'm currently living. I live in Madison, Wisconsin. We're going to get 6 to 12 inches tomorrow of snow. So I'm looking forward to going to the conference. And Lori Morrow, who's one of the guests, is going to be one of the speakers for our conference. And we're having, I think, 4 keynote speakers and about 12 breakout sessions. And so we try to highlight women that are in the field, because there are not that many women in the field. And so women have, I think, a unique perspective in apologetics. And so that's what we do. We have, we're going to talk about finding your voice, which I just lost. Find your voice, and how do you find your voice in a culture that is sort of anti-Christian and against what some of the things that we believe. And so we're going to be talking about the traditional apologetic stuff, where, the defense of the resurrection, which Laura will be talking about, and then some more kind of current cultural hot topics like critical race theory, feminism, all that kind of stuff. So it's going to be a really good conference, and you guys can make it. It'd be great to see you guys out there.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And we're going to get back to that. I'm going to ask you some questions about that in a second. So
Sure.
Lori?
Hi, my name is Lori Morrow, and I run a YouTube channel and a blog called The Spoonfed Soul, primarily because I'd been raised in a Christian church, in a Christian home, but my personal experience was one where I had to come back to Christ, not because I had rejected him, but just because I had kind of become lazy in my following and in my discipleship. And when I began to relearn scripture, my whole life changed. I feel like there was healing on the inside that, nothing else really had been able to touch. And so the more confident, it just so happened that my pastor at the time was leading a Bible study called How Do We Know the Bible is the Bible? Mm-hmm. And I was relearning scripture at that point, kind of digging into my own faith. And I had never heard the term apologetics. He never mentioned the term apologetics, as far as I know. And but he taught us how we could be assured that the Bible was reliable, its history, its manuscript evidence, all sorts of things that I had never even thought about before. And so the juxtaposition of learning the scriptures on a devotional level, at the same time I was learning the reliability of the scriptures from an evidential level, somehow sort of fast-tracked my spiritual growth at a really, really crucial time in my life. And so when I did finally really dig into the study of apologetics in particular, I just wanted to tell every woman that I know, for her own sake, for her own health, for her own spiritual health, and that of shepherding her children. And so my heart is not only to reach women, but it's also to integrate our devotional discipleship with apologetics, so that we don't just expand the content of our personal faith, but we also expand our confidence in God and in our faith. And so that's what I'm attempting to do.
Oh, that's fantastic. And both of you have Twitter accounts. Both of you are active on Twitter, in case people are here and they haven't met you before. You've got some great information that you put out there. You do it in a very kind manner, and I think that's really appreciated. But I want to go back to talking about this conference that's coming up. So, which I won't be able to go to, unfortunately, because that's right exactly when our school year starts, or our semester starts here. But I want to go back to that, because I want to ask you, you just mentioned, Lisa, you mentioned something about, I think you said race theory and feminism. I think you said that.
Yeah, so we have Krista Bontrager and Monique Dusson, who are going to be talking about critical race theory and how that's affecting, some of the ways people are interpreting the Bible and how that affects sort of Orthodox Christianity, because a lot of that is getting into the church and making, its influence. And then we're going to be talking with Lori Stewart, who is the president of Women in Apologetics. And she used to be a feminist. She was a hardcore feminist before she came to Christ. And so she just did a whole thesis on, feminism and Christianity and, what does it mean to be a woman who is a Christian and yet, not buy into the modern sort of thought of what it means to be a woman. And so she talks a little bit about that, and she's going to be addressing those issues, because it's really difficult to talk to a non-Christian woman who sees, for instance, the Bible as being sexist, or oppressive, or those kinds of things. So I don't know, I haven't read her thesis, so I don't know exactly what she addresses in that, but I know that that's been her passion. So she's going to be talking about that. And then we've got Joe Vitale from Ravi Zacharias. She's going to be one of the keynotes. Alicia Wood, also from Ravi Zacharias' ministry. Jean Jones, who is married to Clay Jones, who writes and talks a lot about discovering hope in the Bible and all these kinds of Bible studies series she's been doing. And then Hilary Ferrer of Mama Bear Apologetics. She just got a really great book out. I don't know if you guys had a chance to read it, but it's excellently written. Oh my gosh. It's so funny. So it talks about cultural lies and how to talk to your kids about cultural lies. So all those will be our keynote speakers. And then we've got another one, Elizabeth Urbanowitz. Hard to say her last name. Sorry, Elizabeth, if you're watching this. She's really good with children. She was a teacher for years and years and years. And so she is going to talk about how can you, train your kids up to, talk about their faith. And so there's a whole bunch more. I mean, A.J. Roberts is going to be from Reasons to Believe, and she's all into the science, and she's an extremely good scientist, and she'll be talking about that. And then Lori's talking about the resurrection and the evidence for the resurrection and how you find your voice in that, how you explain that. Rachel Shockey, who is our executive director for Women in Apologetics, she's an amazing artist. And so she's got a really interesting take on apologetics. She takes art and shows the beauty. And here's another really good reason why God exists. Because how do we even know what beauty is? Beauty is like, you see a sunset, right? Everybody knows a sunset is beautiful. Why does everybody know a sunset is beautiful? I mean, why do we have this innate sense that sunset is gorgeous? Who doesn't think sunset's gorgeous? So anyways, Rachel Shockey is going to talk about art and apologetics. And then we've got a whole bunch more. I don't want to go into all the details of them, but there's more information on the site, womenandapologetics.com. So it's going to be really good. And every year we have a theme. So, we try to sort of go along the lines of theme-based stuff. And we're going to have really good worship. And the worship gal that's leading worship, she actually has written a whole album that's apologetic related, which is really cool.
Wow.
So.
No,
yeah.
That sounds super exciting. I really wish I could go. Honestly, that just really sounds like fun.
Well, what you can do, if you can't go, you can live stream it.
That's what I was going to ask you. Is there a way that we can be watching from afar?
Watch it. Yep. They're going to do all the keynotes will be live streamed. And I think up to 4 breakout sessions and the worship will be live streamed. And I don't think it's very expensive. I think it's like $20 or something like that. It's really, really inexpensive. And the conference as a whole is only like $55. So it's a good deal, man. I mean, you get a lot of really good education. You meet people, you network. I mean, it's really excellent. So people walk away from these conferences just really empowered and just nice to find like-minded people, people that, like we're doing, talking about these things. And these things really matter. These things are life and death kind of things. I mean, this is like the purpose of life and why we're here. I mean, there is no better things to talk about.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I just see, I want to mention the chat here. I've got a few people in there right now. Prophet David McGuire, Slam RN, that's Susan. Susan said she just followed you guys on Twitter.
Thank you.
She's great. And Jesus is Lord. So we've got some great people just sort of paying attention right now. I'm really excited. And I want to put that into context, what you just said with $55 for the conference, because I've been to a lot of conferences and I've never been to one that's less than $500.
Really?
So, academic conferences are very expensive, and sometimes they're $1,000. I mean, if we go to AACSB, which is our accreditation agency, if I go to their conferences, that used to run around over $1,000.
Oh my
so
God.
$55 is a huge bargain to go to a conference, and to be able to watch it from afar for $20. Wow. That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's a great deal.
And so let me mention, let's first talk about, I think we should talk a little bit about our conversation that at least I had, and Lori was in the thread on Twitter. And I said, I made this statement that objective morality. So I talk about what objective morality is, and it seems to be very confusing for people. And so I basically made this statement. I said, if we have transcendent, objective moral values and duties, then a transcendent moral lawgiver must exist. And then I said, well, we do have objective transcendent moral values and duties. And I tried to I pointed at a lot of academic studies that show, for example, that we all share these values of life, liberty, freedom. These are self-evident. They're in our Declaration of Independence. I mean, these are the kinds of things that not just Americans, but the United Nations and others have embraced and known that these are self-evident things. We value life, for example. Right. And so we have these values, and then we also have these duties to follow the golden rule. They've done studies that have shown that everyone, basically, no matter what the religion is, or even atheism and humanism, know that we should, even if we don't, should follow the golden rule. So if we have these, then there has to be something that transcends generations and people and eras and cultures. And that can't be grounded in people because it transcends people. So it has to be something that's transcendent. And so then that points to God. And so when I say that on Twitter, I get so much backlash. People say, we've shown you that this is wrong. I'm like, just because you tweeted at me, you're wrong, doesn't mean that you've rebutted my statement. And so Lori and I were trying to explain to somebody, and they said, well, I said, you guys are appealing to this standard of honesty. If you say that I'm dishonest, you're actually appealing to a standard. And so you're not saying that this is just your opinion. And for some reason, these people are just like really confused. What do you guys think about that?
You want to go for it, Lori?
Sure. Yeah, I have so much fun in these conversations, honestly. I used to be really intimidated by Twitter because it can be so hateful and it can be so vitriolic. But I have come to appreciate Twitter because it gives me the opportunity to really kind of work some of these things out. And when I explain something like SJ was talking about, and it doesn't fly, and I'm thinking, okay, that was actually a pretty good explanation. It forces me to maybe consider, especially since you are limited in your characters, right? How long your response can be. It forces me to have to rethink and reevaluate and kind of come up with some other sort of illustration. But it seems like to me that what most people, secularists or atheists, however they might classify themselves, would think that because we all have the sense that there are certain things that are just wrong, because we have that it exists some sort of a brute fact. And since there is no God, according to that particular worldview, since there is no God, then it must be a product of evolution or common sense or compassion or something like that. So they're not necessarily denying that morals don't exist, but that they are all internally. And once when they're internally derived, and once we decide on them for ourselves, and that sort of creates some sort of pseudo objectivity. Now I can appeal to that because I see it, because I recognize it, I have it, and I can appeal to that as a standard. And what they don't understand, what it seems to me that the problem is that we can't assign something an objective standard. We can each of us come to our own conclusions about what is right and wrong. Certainly we can do that. But that doesn't, if we're truly materialistic, if this is a materialistic universe and we are truly simply materialistic beings, and that's all that we are, then no matter how deeply or how completely I am given or convinced that something is wrong, I don't have the opportunity to impose that on you. Because subjective reality is exactly what you guys were talking about earlier. Subjective reality is internal, so I can feel it, but that has no binding on you. It has no binding on anyone. It can't dictate anyone else's actions, and that's where I see the mistake is happening. Is that once somebody recognizes that something is moral or immoral as they see it, they presume that somehow creates an objective standard that other people that we should all recognize, and that's just not the way subjectivism or subjective morality or relativistic morality works. There is no fixed and binding standard if morality truly is subjective.
You're right. And it reminds me of if I were to compare it to a goalpost in a football game, morality stands as the goalpost, and we try to hit it. we try to get that football through the goalpost and do that sort of thing. But the goalpost doesn't change. You're not moving the goalpost around. It is not a function of our opinions. And people, some reason, have such a hard time grasping this. And what's really interesting, I actually went on Twitter and I went and looked up Richard Dawkins, because I know Richard Dawkins is a relativist because I read his book, God Delusion.
Oh yeah.
He thinks everything is relative, meaning that his opinion is just as valuable as a Nazi's opinion. Essentially, that's what he means. So the Nazis felt like the Jewish people were less than human, and he felt that that was complete. I mean, he can't make an argument against that as a relativist. And so the funny thing is, I looked on his Twitter account and I noticed a lot of times he's calling people dishonest and doing things like that. And I thought, now what standard is this man using?
Right, that's exactly.
I always go to just a basic description of subjective and objective. So subjective would be lying in the subject. So I like chocolate ice cream. That's a subjective opinion. So does that mean that chocolate ice cream is always going to be everybody else's favorite? No. But is ice cream always going to be made from cream? I mean, so it's kind of like, so the truth then would have to then lie in the object. So it's going to be outside of a person. And I think that that's where people get confused. It's like, okay, if it's outside of me, then where is it? If we are in truly a materialistic world, then there is nothing outside of me. I'm just, chemicals and flesh and bones, and the world is just physical. What we're saying is that it shows that there is an immaterial existence. Because would murder be wrong no matter what? Yes, murder would always be wrong no matter what time period you were in, no matter what people group you're in, no matter, 500 years from now or 500 years behind us. Murder always should be wrong. And if it doesn't become wrong, if it's not always wrong, then we're in big trouble. That's what happened with the Nazis. Their whole, that shows you what happens when subjective morality takes place. Because I always go back, and I talked to you about this before, SJ, the Hunger Games is a great analogy for subjective morality, because you have President Snow who sets the morals, who says, okay, this is how it's going to go down. This is how we're going to keep in control. And we're going to, take these 24 kids, and one of these kids is going to, we're going to survive, and the other ones are going to die. And that's how we're dealing with it. So that's one man setting the rules. So if we truly embrace subjective morality, that's what we're going to have. And it's going to be scary, because I always think about, in 100 years from now, what if Christianity becomes illegal? All of a sudden it's like not okay to have freedom of religion in the United States, and it becomes illegal. And it has before in other countries, and other countries deal with this all the time. That's why I love this country, because this country has the freedom of religion. Even if you think I'm nuts for believing what I believe, I still have a right to believe it, right? But if we go into a point where there's just, one person dictating the morale, the morals of the world, then it's going to be flimsy, mamby-pamby, just going to switch around and change, and it's not going to be grounded in something. It needs to be grounded in an objective source. C.S. Lewis talked about this, and he talked about what they call the Tao, or Tao. And he says that that's kind of the same thing you were talking about with the golden rule. Like, we all have that sense, right? Of everyone has a sense of this kind of thing. Yeah, there you go. And so he was saying that even if we can't all agree on religion, which we're not going to all agree on religion, that's just not going to happen. We need to have some sort of, Tao, kind of like a universal understanding of human rights. And I think we kind of have that. We have that in the human rights, organizations, so we recognize there are human rights, and that transcends any culture, transcends any religion. And if we don't have that, then it's going to be all over the place, and it's going to be scary.
Yeah, and I think I want to build off of what you're saying. Mike Winter is in here, and he says, can you ask Lisa if the act we call murder is never changing and therefore objective? I want to just clarify something that I think is really important. When we say there's objective moral values, the value is not murder. The value is actually life. And so we value life, and in that same thing that we value life, anything that goes against valuing life, let's just say murdering somebody or raping someone, these are acts that the act itself is not the objective standard. The standard is the value of life. And so right,
because you're violating that person's right to live. You're playing God. You're taking that person's life. You don't have that right. And so that's so in the 10 Commandments, for instance, when it says thou shalt not kill, it didn't mean just kill, like, in self-defense kind of killing. It's taking somebody's life against them. I mean, you're ripping them off of life. You don't have that right. No one has that right. So that's what I'm talking about regarding that. Yeah.
Exactly. So I got in the chat, Prophet David's mentioning the abortion issue in the United States, and that's a big issue. And I think he said here 60 million babies have been by abortions. And this is not talking about the very small percentage, like 1% of cases that are based on rape or incest. We're talking about the vast majority of cases that are actually out of convenience. And I'm not trying to slam anybody who had an abortion at one point, made a mistake, that kind of thing. I just want to say that right now, just trying to get people to understand that baby is a life. I think that's important. And I think people might think twice about having an abortion if they value the baby not being a termination of pregnancy or a tissue. I think that's really important.
So it depends on when life begins. And that's the big argument. So does life begin at conception, which Christians believe, or does life begin when they're born and they take that first breath? That's what the pro-choice people say. When you take that first breath, when you're viable outside of the womb, that's when life begins. But the Christians don't believe that. The Christians believe life begins at conception. So I think that's the argument of the day regarding that.
Yeah, and so I want to say, Mike Winter saying, are you saying killing is objectively wrong? I know that you specified the word murder and not killing, because killing could be in self-defense.
Right.
So murder is like premeditated. Hey, I hate my neighbor, I'm going to go out and murder that person. That's just wrong. And I think
even if it's not premeditated, even if it's just on the, I mean, there's unfortunately a lot of murders that happen in the heat of the moment, because people lose their anger, and they let, anger and all that stuff overcome them, and then they take somebody's life. Well, even that's wrong. You can't take somebody's life. You don't have that right. No one has that right. And so that's what the objective moral standards are. It's like, no one has the right to steal. You can't take something from me because you want it. That's not your right. You don't have that right. I mean, these are the kinds of things that should always be objective morals. It should never lie in a person's, personal opinion. That's what we're talking about. It lies. The objectives lie outside of people.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I think that is a good way to distinguish this, people have a lot of confusion about this kind of stuff, but I think if we look at the question, does objective morality exist? Now, this is an ontological question. So if you ask about ontology with morality, it relates to the very essence or the existence of something. So this does not speak to your epistemology, meaning how you came to believe that objective morality exists or how you have interpreted objective morality. It doesn't have to do with that kind of thing. So I think if people could just understand that you can't argue and say, well, just because Joe doesn't act objectively moral, then objective morality must not exist. That's like saying just because Joe doesn't understand math, then math must not exist.
Right. So, I think so too. That's what I've been thinking out the last couple of days since you and I have had that particular exchange on Twitter. I've seen that a lot. That certain, I've seen the response that people will say that because there are so many different ideas about morality, it's therefore subjective. No, it's being treated subjectively. That's the difference. Morality actually does exist objectively. If it didn't, then there is nothing that any of us can call moral. Now we can each decide for ourselves how we want to define morality and live according to that. But there's nothing transcendent about it. There's absolutely no reason if subjective reality really were, if objective reality doesn't exist and subjective morality is all we really have, then this ought to be the most peaceful, kind, patient, because nobody could ever call anybody else out. The only authority of any kind of morality at all would live inside each individual. And that means I can't say that your morality is right or wrong or good or bad or helpful or not helpful or honest or dishonest. I can only speak to my own morality if there is no objective sense. And so clearly you can look at your Twitter feed or your Facebook feed and see that people are outraged, like you were saying, Dawkins calling all sorts of people out on all sorts of issues. And yet he believes that morality is subjective, that it doesn't exist objectively. So where does he get the idea that he can call anybody out? What he's basically saying is, you've violated my morality and I get to say something about it. But that doesn't mean that they have actually violated the morality, a morality. And so it's pointless to say you violated my morality. So what? So what if we violate one another's moral ideas? If there's no objective, transcendent, fixed binding standard of morality to appeal to, then you and I can act however we want, and there's no reason to hold anybody accountable for anything. And so that, I think, is where the confusion lies, is people feel like if they sense a morality, then they can call that objective. They can call that a standard. They can hold other people accountable to that standard and yet say, but it's mine, and you don't have to have mine, but I'm going to call you out when you violate mine. And it's just kind of fuzzy. It's just fuzzy thinking on the whole morality issue. And either it exists objectively and we're all bound to it, or it doesn't. That's really the only two options we have.
And I think that gives us so much great evidence for God, because if you say, well, where did this all come from? Because animals go and forcibly copulate. Animals, kill each other. They grab each other's food. They steal. They do everything that we know we're not supposed to do. Where did this knowledge come from, if not God?
Well, and I mean, because morality isn't a material thing. It's a behavioral mandate. Well, where does that come from? Where does a behavioral mandate come from a materialist world? What source of matter can actually generate a behavioral mandate? Well, it can't. Morality is not a material thing.
We know before I was a Christian, I didn't come to Christ until I was 25 years old. And before that, I was a radical partier girl and did all kinds of stuff. And I was all about me and blah, 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 blah. But I innately knew there was something in me that knew I was doing bad stuff. Mm-hmm. And so, I didn't want to think I was doing bad stuff. I wanted to say, oh, it's all about me. I can do whatever I want. Kind of like what we were talking about. It's like, who cares what other people think? I'm my own woman and blah, 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 but deep down, if I was really, really honest with myself, there was a sense of guilt. Like I just had a feeling that this probably isn't a good idea that I'm doing this stuff, And so once I became a Christian, oh my gosh, I repented so bad. I was so broken. Seriously, I was broken because it was the revelation of God that really opened my eyes to the sinfulness that I had. And I think a lot of people don't get that. They just don't want to acknowledge that. It's really hard to look at yourself and be really honest and say, you know what? I'm a sinner. I mean, that's hard. It's not popular. It's not whatever, but that's that innate sense that we have when we do something wrong, and it's not evolution. It's not just social pressures. There's a knowing in our gut, we just have that gut knowledge. And that what drove me to, the brokenness is ultimately what God used in my life to have me to see him. I had to be broken. My pride, had to be broken. My acknowledgement that I did break the morals, that I probably broke all 10 of them. I don't even know. But, I think that those kinds of things, when we're in a society that says, hey, it's all about me and do whatever feels good to you. And it's really not a society that really wants to acknowledge the sinfulness.
And let's explain why evolution does not explain this, because evolution can help explain what they would call our intuitions, and it doesn't really explain human reasoning. And we know that the reasoning and the intuitions are part and parcel of our behaviors and that kind of thing. But also, what evolution doesn't explain is that conscience that you just said you have. So we have this conscience, and some would say, well, how is the conscience any different from our intuitions? But if you look at a conscience, it's really unique, because our intuitions based on evolution would say we want to survive. And I always use this example, but if we saw a little boy at the edge of a pond and we saw an alligator lurching out of the pond, our intuitions say, run, man, get out of here. You got to get out of here, because if that alligator doesn't get that boy, it's coming after you next. But our conscience calls us out and says, no, you go risk your life. And where does that risking our life for another come from? And some would say, well, hey, I saw an animal do that. Well, this is God's world. Maybe that's something God had intended, So evolution is not dichotomous it's not mutually exclusive of everything. So if we see animals doing something empathetic, I think that should be what we see in God's world. And so.
Well, another thing about consciousness is we have amazing imaginations. I mean, we are creative. What Rachel Shockey is going to be talking about regarding art. It's like, I'm sorry, animals don't create art. I mean,
No.
they mimic. Yeah, I've seen like apes mimic art. Like they'll paint, like, you know, but they're just mimicking something. They're not creating something. I mean, that's another way that we're created in the image of God, is because we have imaginations. That didn't evolve. I mean, that's not just something that, you know. I mean, these are the kinds of things that are just signs of a spirit, signs of a soul.
Yeah.
You know, immaterial parts of us. And I think it's fascinating and wonderful, and we should embrace that. I mean, if we were purely biochemical machines, there would be no reason to create art. I mean, maybe you could build a building for function, but why paint it? Why make it purple? You know, I mean, there's no reason to do that, you know, go ahead.
That's actually a great point, Lisa, because if we are really, you're right, if we are just biochemical machines, which is what Darwin says we are, the theory of evolution kind of assumes that that's just all there is to the human makeup. Well, if that's true, then everything that we think, including our moral reasoning, but also our just other reasoning, our general reasoning, our everyday reasoning, all of that is nothing other than the final output of a series of neurological chemical events. That's it. That's all you've got. It's very limiting. We can't think any other way. We can't change what we think because we'd have to change our DNA to do that. Everything is mechanical. Everything operates mechanically. And so therefore that there's no reason, that doesn't, in my mind, that simply doesn't create the kind of environment from which we can explain morals or consciousness, or even to some degree emotions and will and those sorts of things. Those things don't have any kind of a grounding. They don't have any kind of source inside a strictly material being that could create those things. That would have to come from a mind. It would have to come from a mental source and a moral source, and that of course would be God. So you're right, it points to all of those things, especially cumulatively point to the existence of something outside of us that is moral, that does serve as a moral authority, that does have mind, and therefore gave mind to us. And of course that points to God, just like SJ's been saying the whole time.
Yeah, and I agree. Both of you have made some really excellent points. Mike Winter is in the chat, and he says, how does it follow that humans being all nature would exclude things like art? So how does it follow that we would exclude things like art?
If evolution is true, art doesn't really have a very practical use. And to me, you know, it's all about, you know, I'm not a scientist, so, you know, don't quote me on my science, but from what I understand about natural selection, it's selected to benefit the species. And so what does art do to benefit the species other than maybe, oh, that's pretty? I don't know. I think I'm a creative person. I need to create. I need to write and create and do that. There's a desire that I have. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't benefit anybody. I mean, it's, you know, unless people like what I write.
Your writing benefits everybody.
But you know what I'm saying? It's just that there's this, it just doesn't make any sense evolutionary wise. I don't think that you should create art, and you don't see it in other species. You don't see them creating art.
But even if you did, like somebody pointed out, well, what about birds that are trying to impress their mates and they might do something and make a fancy nest, or peacocks and peahens? I mean, we see that kind of stuff where I would try to get people to realize this doesn't mean that there's no God because you see a peahen and a peacock next to each other trying to be impressive.
But that's a point though. They're doing that for a reason. They're doing that to procreate. I mean, I don't write my stuff to procreate.
Thankfully, right?
But yeah, I mean, that's what I think. I think that there's, you know, if you're purely going with natural selection, there are some things that human beings do that don't help in that process. You know, it's not. Go ahead.
I want to add on to that, and I want to add on to what Lori said too with free will. I think you were kind of alluding to free will a little bit there.
Yeah.
And I've heard a lot, I mean, a surprisingly large amount of atheists who say that they don't think we have free will. They think that our biology has determined all of our actions. And I feel like that's sort of saying that they don't want to be held accountable. But what do you guys think about the whole free will argument? Have you thought about that a little bit?
Oh yeah, I thought about that a lot. There's a guy named Daniel Dennett, who's the scientist who talks about free will and says that it's an illusion and we don't really have it. And he argues for it. And I don't know how he gets beyond the intention of people. Like if we're truly biochemical responses to our environment, then that means we're responding. We respond to stimuli. So how do we intend? How do we have foresight? How do we plan? Where does that come from? If it's just all a bunch of biochemical neurons firing off in our brain, where does the intentionality come from? I just don't, that's one thing that they really, there's all kinds of weird theories out there, but it's not really grounded in any logical thing, I don't think. I mean, there's so much about the human thinking process that if we were completely just meat robots, we wouldn't have intentionality. Now, we could have intentionality in maybe like the ants that store away for the winter or whatever, as far as survival, that you could have intentionality for that, maybe because that's an instinct. But as far as, having any type of foresight or planning, 5 years down the road for some project you want to do, I mean, those kind of brain things that you think about, I mean, how do you justify that if it's just purely biochemical? And there was another thing. I was talking to this little atheist gal that comes to with Ratio Christi group that I have at UW-Madison. I don't run it, I just go to it. But there was a couple of atheists that come regularly, and they're really cool, and we have some really great conversations. And so they're a couple, and I was talking to them, and I looked at her. She's a former Christian, and she rejected Christianity because she didn't think there was enough evidence for it, and they're very materialistic. And I asked her a question, and I think it really stopped her in her tracks. So I said, so the love that you share with your boyfriend, I said, is that just biochemical responses? Do you just love him because you're biochemical? Then how would you even describe loving your grandmother then? Is that a biochemical response? Why would you love your grandmother? And she looked at me, and then she looked at her boyfriend, and he goes, yeah, because I think it's just biochemical responses. And I could tell her face fell. Like she really, in her deep heart, didn't want to hear that. She didn't want to think that, you just love me because of biochemical responses. So I made him think, at least. I mean, I didn't convert him, but I made him think.
Sometimes you just have to plant a seed.
Yeah. So, I mean, love, how do you explain love? It's not just, love is, if it was a purely naturalistic, materialistic thing, then wouldn't love just be all about having, more species procreating?
Yeah, well, I think that people, if you look at determinism, and I've looked at, I mean, there's theological, we're talking about biological determinism. So we're talking about that, saying that it's in your DNA to act certain ways because maybe your parents were likely to do certain things. If you take that at a very low level and say, yes, we are predetermined. Once we learn to walk and talk and that we learn how to eat, how to pick up a spoon and all those sorts of things. Some of that is determined. We get up in the morning, we have these certain habits and we don't think much about them. But what this really gets at that people need to think about is, let's look at the high level decisions that you make. And that's where determinism, it doesn't work at all. So you say, okay, I'm going to write a book. Now that did not come from my DNA saying I'm going to write a book. It just, I'm going to, for some people, I'm going to claim that God does not exist. Now this is a very high level decision because now you're going against everything that your body's been hardwired to do. So, I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, there's actually, I think it's pretty well established in the literature that if atheism is true, if there is no God and we are just biological robots, essentially biological machines, there's lots of literature that suggests then that we are sort of bound over then to our biology, our DNA, and therefore free will, even though we think that we live life as though free will is a real thing, it isn't. It can't be. It's all, like you say, it's SJ, it's all biologically determined. And the idea of free will is really just an illusion. It's something that we pretend, or that we just operate on assumption is the case, but it isn't actually the case. There's several good clips, one in particular where Richard Dawkins, I think, is having a conversation with Lawrence Krauss, I think it is. And that this question comes up. And he says specifically that he had been in a conversation with Christopher Hitchens prior to his death. And someone had asked Christopher Hitchens that same question. And Hitchens' response was, that question was, do you believe in free will? And Christopher Hitchens says, I have no choice, because we're all determined. And so then he goes on, Dawkins goes on to kind of elaborate a little bit on his own position. And he basically says, I am a materialist. That commits me to a materialist position. And therefore, I can't honestly say that free will actually exists. And yet, that is not at all how we live our lives. That is not our common sense view of life. That's not our expectation of life. We don't go through life acting as though we have no choices. We make decisions about about careers. We make decisions about parenting. We make decisions, you know, thousands and thousands of times a day. And the reality is our decision-making process either is a conscious one that is free from our biological control, or it's completely dependent literally on biochemical inputs, environment, and the outputs that those create, a mechanical process that computes literally a decision at the other end, in which case we are literally robots. And so therefore, those are our only two choices. And so I think like we've been talking about all along, the fact that we can think, the fact that we do decide, the fact that we just, in some cases, deliberate, you know, when we're in between that spot of making a decision, we think about things this way, and then we think about them that way, but we haven't actually made a decision yet. Those are all evidences of consciousness, of a mind that is functioning independently of the biological, the more simple biological processes, like just the neurons firing, or just your digestive system doing whatever it does. That's different. And so that has to have some sort of a ground. And again, it goes toward the existence of God. God has a mind. And when he made us in his image, he gave us something. He certainly didn't give us an omniscient mind, but he gave us a mind. And that's why we can have these deliberations. It's why we can think. It's why thinking is part of the human process. It's why we deliberate. It's why we have intelligence. And it's also why we have moral reasoning, like we originally discussed. And so, yeah, I'm a big believer that free will, then, if we have it, and I believe that we do, is evidence against atheism and evolution, and is evidence for God and theism.
I agree with you. I think that's it. And I want to point out something. Prophet David's making a comment here that I think is a really good one. He says neuroplasticity proves free will, that we can affect the changes in our brains. And I think that's a great point, because our minds change. The more you learn, the studies that they're showing on learning right now, a lot of people used to think that as you age, your mind starts basically going to trash. but they're finding that the more you learn, the wirings inside your brain start connecting more connections, and you're actually able to make your brain stronger, smarter, wiser, that kind of thing by learning. And so that speaks to this too.
Well, and isn't that interesting that that's what Paul said in Romans 12, 2000 years ago? You know, he says, let God change you, make you a different person by changing the way that you think. We are responsible to renew our minds according to the truth of God's word and the activity of the Holy Spirit, cooperating with the activity of the Holy Spirit. So even Paul knew that there was free will, and Paul knew that we can change our minds, that the mind is a thing that can be changed because God has given it to us. And once we import, or allow God to import, I should say, the word and the Holy Spirit, then it begins to function differently. And I think that that's really good evidence that the Bible is trustworthy and has been telling us the truth all along.
There's another scripture in Philippians. I think it's Philippians 4:8, but don't quote me on that. But it's, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is, pure, beautiful, all those kinds of things. Think about those things.
Yes.
So Paul was writing to the Philippians, what you think about will affect who you are.
Yes.
But it's like, if you constantly think, for instance, negative thoughts, if you're like filling your mind with a bunch of negative stuff and you're just like watching violent stuff and just, you will become that. And you'll act out these kinds of things. And so that's one of the reasons why, we're supposed to be, as Christians, becoming more Christ-like. Because I know I've been walking with the Lord for over 30 years now. I am so much of a nicer, more moral person than I would have had I not walked with him. But how I've done that is by changing the way I think, by reading the word, by what you were saying, Lori, letting the Holy Spirit highlight things to me, like showing me where I need to grow, where I need to be less selfish, less self-centered, less, whatever, I think that those kinds of things are really important to show that, yes, we can change our mind. That was a really good point. I'm glad that guy pointed that out. We have the ability to actually change the way our brain functions. That's really cool. And I like the fact that, you get older and you can still learn stuff, because I'm getting older and I want to still learn stuff, and it'll help me keep fresh in my mind, So I think that those kinds of things all indicate that we're not just biochemical machines.
Sure.
And I think it's really sad that people think that, actually. It kind of breaks my heart, because it makes life, I don't know, less wonderful in some sense. I love the fact that we have a spirit and that there's mystery to life. and that we're going someplace with all of this, that we're, that life doesn't end when you die, and that's another thing that about consciousness. And this is a whole other subject about near-death experiences, but near-death experiences are, being much more medically proven and shown evidentially now to show that the consciousness survives bodily death. People see stuff they could not have seen, if they were truly dead on that, hospital bed. There's been people like, seeing like numbers or certain types of people working on them. Like I remember reading one story about some guy that was bald, right? He was working on the person that died, and the person that died was able to see that he had a bald head. How could you see that if you're lying on the gurney dead? These are the kinds of things that show that, there is something that survives bodily death, and that's the consciousness, that's your soul. And to me, that's fascinating. Why wouldn't you want to believe that? And there's evidence to believe. I agree. Yeah, it makes life wonderful and mysterious and exciting.
Yeah, it does. And I saw a case with a woman who was dead, pronounced dead, and she somehow was outside of her body, and she saw a shoe that was on the roof of the hospital that she was in. And how could she possibly know that?
That is why would you remember a shoe?
Yeah, she saw a shoe.
Like, what about the angels? Tell me about that.
But when my mom was giving birth to me, my mom told me that suddenly she felt like, I'm sure it's a painful experience giving birth, especially if you're not getting the epidurals and all that stuff. She somehow was outside of her body at one point, looking down at the doctors doing that. My mom has no reason to lie to me about that. And so I believe her.
Yeah. So, well, and that's another really good point. Why are we even doing this? To lie to everybody? To say, hey, you know what? Joke's on you. We're just fooling you. We're not doing that. We're doing this because we bona fidely believe this is true, and we want to share it with people because it makes your life better. So many people are dying hopeless. There's suicide rates are on the rise. Anxiety is all over the place. The world is crazy. But when you have faith in God and you have hope for a future that's not going to end when you die, it totally changes your perspective on everything. And this is why we're doing this. This is why, SJ, I so appreciate what you do. It's not like you're, doing this for money and just trying to trick people. You're not even getting any money for this. You're just doing this because
it costs me a lot more than it.
Well, yeah, you're doing this because you care about people. You want to spread the truth. You want to do this because it's true. And the same thing with Lori. With her Spoonfed Soul stuff, she's trying to help people connect to God. I really appreciate that about you, Lori, because, that's another aspect. It's like once you know that God exists, well, then how do you connect with him? How do you get to know him? And Lori talks a lot about that with her, her devotionals and stuff. Because it's like, okay, and once you get the fact that, okay, we're God is real, this is true. Well, then you have to develop a relationship with this being that's unseen. And with all the distractions in the world that we have, that's not easy to do today. I feel like the Christians now, we have a harder time, than the Christians back then, because we have the internet, we have, video games, we've got movies, we're like plugged in 24/7. I always joke around with my friends. It's like people are voluntarily plugged into the matrix, and the more we distance ourselves from the spirit and plug ourselves into all this stuff, the harder it is to actually connect to this spiritual being, God, who is real. And so I think that's another whole aspect of this. It's like, okay, so we can argue all day long why, moral objectives seem to point to God, why there's a consciousness, why, consciousness survives bodily death, the evidence is for Christianity. And once people get that and they're really open to it, well, then how do you connect to this God? And that's a real aspect, I think, of apologetics and these kinds of things that isn't discussed very often.
Yeah, and somebody's saying something in the chat that reminds me, he's mentioning Muslims and Hindus and what about their experiences. And it totally reminds me of that video that I just listened to this morning with Deepak Chopra and Greg Koukl. And so I just want to mention something with that. One of the things that people a lot of times will say is, wait a second, what about all of these other religions? Does that mean because there's all of these other religions that your religion can't be true? And I would basically say, well, that's not the question. Just because there's all kinds of different interpretations of what God is, it doesn't mean that one of those interpretations is not true. It's basically saying, because there's 10 flavors of ice cream, it doesn't mean there's no vanilla. So.
Well, and there is a spiritual realm. Right. So there's a spiritual realm that people do connect with that are not Christians. There is spiritual entities out there that we cannot deny. And so some of these people do connect and do have experiences, you know, and so we can't deny those experiences. I think that what we have to go is we have to say, okay, maybe you had a little taste of this, right? So you have a little slice of the pie, but the whole pie, the whole truth is in the person of Jesus Christ. And the evidence for his resurrection, which Lori's, you know, going to talk about at the conference, I mean, points to Christianity. So before I was a Christian, I was spiritual in some ways. I did all kinds of weird spiritual stuff. I used to go to New Age weird like conferences and stuff like that, and tarot cards and Ouija boards and weird stuff like that. And sometimes I would tap into stuff and I would sense stuff. So the way I look at these other religions is that, you know, we can't deny that people do have experiences. But I go to my pie analogy, that you have a slice of the pie, but the full pie is in Jesus Christ, and he is the full truth. And that's why there are so many other religions, I think, because people get a slice of the truth, right? It's just enough to sort of pull them into a different maybe mindset. But the full truth is in the person of Jesus Christ. You know, nobody ever, I mean, everybody wants a piece of his pie. It's like a lot of Hindus, I mean, Hindus will believe in Jesus, but they believe in, you know, millions of other gods as well. Muslims believe in Jesus. They just don't believe he was, you know, the son of God, but they believe he's a good prophet. You know, I mean, Jews, I mean, they knew Jesus was a historical person. So lots of people know about Jesus, and they'll take a piece of Jesus, but if they don't really pursue and continue to pursue the truth in that, I mean, the truth is he is the truth. He said that. I'm the way, the truth, and the life.
Yeah, I want to go to Lori and just I want to ask about the resurrection in just 1 second. But before I didn't use a very good example. So let me just say, because there's many flavors of ice cream doesn't mean ice cream doesn't exist. Not vanilla ice cream. That wasn't a very good example. So I just want to clarify. Lori, you just mentioned, Lisa, you just mentioned that Lori has reasons that she's going to say in the conference. So I'm just curious, can you give us a little bit of information about that? Reasons to believe in Jesus?
Yeah, actually, my breakout session is actually on the reliability of the scriptures and not the resurrection, but I did teach a resurrection class recently, so I'll see if I can kind of blow the dust off and pull some things out from a few weeks ago. But I think that there are, if we look at the Gospels, and if we look at the accounts of the Gospels, every single Gospel account regarding the resurrection has a couple things that are the same. There's always an angelic presence, which especially in a Jewish context would always be in the context of the presence of God. Angels were always used anytime God was making an earth-shaking announcement, or anytime there was an angel involved, then God was always present. The angel was acting as a messenger, a conduit of information between God and us. And so all four Gospels.
I never thought of that.
Yeah. So all four Gospels have an angel in the context of the resurrection saying, in all four books, all four Gospels, the angel says something that reiterates that the resurrection has happened, you know, depending on which Gospel you read. And so we also have women at the tomb. In every Gospel account, the people who see the tomb first, who come back proclaiming the resurrection of God, are the women. And so if the Gospel writers had actually made this story up and expected to pass it off in a masculine Jewish context, they would have never made up the fact that the women were the ones who were the ones who were up and early. It was the women's devotion to Jesus that got them up and early out to the tomb. It wasn't the men. The women led that charge. Then they got there and they saw that the tomb was empty. In all four accounts, the women were there first. The women see it. The women proclaim it. So that means that this God has has resurrected the Jewish Messiah to women. So that's not something that the Gospel writers would have made up if they were trying to snow job everybody. They just, that would have never crossed their minds that would be helpful. That would be something that would be counterproductive. If they were making up this story, what they would have said is, we were the heroes. We got there first. We saw us. Let us tell you what God has done. And they wouldn't have passed that job off to the women. So that's really good evidence. And then obviously the tomb is empty. In every four Gospel accounts, the tomb is empty on every single account. And if we can't have an empty tomb without a resurrection. We know that Jesus was crucified. That's an extremely historically well-documented historical fact. That's not something we can just kind of casually brush over. We know that Jesus existed. We know that he died. We know that he was crucified, that historians, even secular historians, will account for that, attest for that information, that history is very unanimous on that point. And so then we go to his tomb and it's empty. Okay, so what if they went to the wrong tomb? Well, that's not really possible, because it was a specific tomb. It was a borrowed tomb. And the gentleman who owned the tomb was a member of the Sanhedrin. So he was not some obscure individual that could have somehow discreetly borrowed that tomb. Everybody knew who this gentleman was. And he went to Pilate to ask for permission to get the body to take to the tomb. So there's the idea that everybody went to the wrong tomb and somehow mistook an empty tomb for a resurrection just doesn't fly in the face of the evidence. And so anyway, I think that those kinds of things that the gospel accounts, if we just read the gospel accounts, and most of us as Christians have read them as stories, and so we don't stop and look at the evidences that are really right there in the stories themselves that really account for the fact that there's really no other explanation to the story other than Jesus really was the Messiah, and he really did die, and God really did raise him from the dead. That's the only thing that makes all of the different pieces of the puzzle come together completely.
And I want to piggyback on what you just said, because I love that. And I definitely want to talk about angels in 1 second. But before we get to angels, because I'm just thinking, as you said that, my mind just started racing on all of the examples of angels all throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. But I definitely want to get to that. But also just to add on, and the apostles, here's what happened. So it's very embarrassing that women were the first there. It's very embarrassing the men were hiding out. And who are being the heroes in this story are the women who were the first ones at the tomb. But beyond that, what the apostles did. So they're hiding out. What got them out of hiding and into the limelight for decades, worshiping and preaching for Jesus? If Jesus didn't appear to them, they would have dispersed and gone back to their homes and returned to their fishing jobs or whatever they were doing before. And so why did they do that? They were persecuted. They were being martyred. Many, crucified upside down, beheaded, all this kind of horrible stuff, jailed. They were not given any sort of favors. This was not a good thing materially for them to do. And so people consider that.
In fact, part of the reason that the church spread as quickly as it did and as widely as it did is because they were fleeing persecution. Because at some point they would come up against a government that said, stop talking about Jesus or we're going to have to take your life. And
Right.
So they would flee to a different part and take the message with them. And we don't have any documented accounts of any apostles recanting their faith in Jesus because they saw it. And, we have multiplicity of statements within the New Testament where people, like, I'm thinking of John, I'm thinking of Luke, I'm thinking of even Paul, Peter even, who they say, I'm writing this down because I saw it. I was there. And so we have really good, honest, early attestations that this is what actually happened. These people are just simply recounting the truth of the events as they experienced them.
Right. And then the Holy Spirit came upon people and gave them power. And so the apostles went on and did things in Jesus's name that blew people away. Like people were getting healed and people were, doing all kinds of stuff through the apostles and their Acts too. The book of Acts is fun to read because there's all kind of cool stuff going on. But, so they were seeing miracles through the followers of Christ, in the first century. And so, and then, Lori made a really good point. I mean, why, if you knew something was a lie, would you go to your death on a lie? I mean, and now you can argue that the Islamic terrorists believe what they believe and they, flew into buildings and took their lives, right? So you could say that, but they have been trained since little children to believe this kind of thing. And a lot of them are chosen to be suicide bombers or whatever. But the apostles and the disciples of Christ were converted as adults, right? And they didn't think that Jesus was even going to resurrect until the end of the age. That's why they weren't expecting it. It was like this like, what? So they weren't expecting it at all. And so you can't argue. It's like apples and oranges. You can't say, well, they were just, brainwashed as kids and, they went to their death because they were brainwashed. Well, they weren't. They didn't expect. That's why a lot of the apostles and stuff had a hard time believing it was true, because they were like, it was so out of their paradigm. They were so expecting it to be at the end of this age, to have bodily resurrection in the middle. I mean, and another thing about their expectations, they also thought that Jesus was going to come as a warrior political guy and he was going to overturn Roman rule. And so their expectations were he was going to be this different person, not the suffering servant, not to die. So, he just rocked their world, all their expectations. And so I think that is a good argument for, why they did what they did, because they knew it was true. They just knew when they were going to die, they were okay with it because they're like, okay, I know where I'm going. They had full confidence that they were going to survive bodily death, that their spirits would go, and I love that story of Jesus on the cross with the two prisoners. And the one prisoner says, remember me when you come into my kingdom. And he looks at him and, I don't know if he looks at him, but in the movie he did, in The Passion of the Christ. But yeah, he said, today you will be in paradise with me. And I hold on to that. It's like that's not, he didn't say, okay, you're going to have to hang out in, purgatory for a while or whatever. It's like, no, when that prisoner died, today he was going to paradise with Christ spiritually. So right at that point, even if this guy got saved on his deathbed, there's hope for us, But, to me, those are the kinds of things that, people weren't expecting that back then. They weren't expecting Jesus to do all of that. They didn't expect him to die. They didn't expect him to be the suffering Messiah. They misread the scriptures. They were confused. We are still today. That's one thing I always go back. It's like, no one goes to heaven on good theology. We have our pretty good theology. We have some, really good stuff out there, but nobody's perfect, especially on the end times, when the second coming is coming. We have all these different theories and stuff, and it's like, you know what? They were wrong the first time around. We're probably going to not be exactly right the second time around either, So we have to hold lightly to all of that. But all this to say is, I think that, there's still martyrs today. There's still people dying for their faith today. A lot in the Middle East. These people are dying for the same thing that people died in the first century, because they know it's true.
Yeah. Well, let me back off. Or actually, I want to point out something first that John Lloyd, he did a super chat. Thank you, John Lloyd. He said, and why would the Jesuits try to murder King James for revealing the true Bible, exposing over 3,000 differences in the Vulgate? So that was something that is a pretty important point that John Lloyd was making as far as the treatment that people have had over time. A lot of Christians were abused and a lot of people didn't have the written word for centuries. Right. Which is another big deal. But I want to go on to something else you guys said. Actually, what you hinted to, Lisa, just a second ago, you hinted to something that's really important. In the Old Testament, there were two versions of the Savior. Okay, so there were two versions of the Messiah. There was the King Messiah, which is the one that is going to be revealed, say in Daniel 7, where we talk about, you will see him coming in the clouds of heaven, sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One. That was a direct reference to Jesus as a very powerful Messiah. Sitting at the right hand was very important to the Jewish people because that made direct reference to, that means that when Jesus said he was going to be, he repeated Daniel 7 to the Pharisees in Mark 14:62. It was very clear to the Pharisees that he was making reference to himself as the Son of God and as the Son of Man. And that was why they killed him. They killed him because he thought he was the Son of Man. So people who try to claim that, oh no, Jesus never thought he was Son of Man. Well, he made a direct reference. And that was the reason the Pharisees ripped their clothing. They were so angry. Right. But there was also the other Messiah in the Old Testament that was described as the suffering servant. So we see that in Isaiah 53. We see it in Daniel 9. We see the anointed one who had to appear in the temple, which was destroyed in the year 70. That was mentioned again in Daniel 9 and also in Malachi 3:1. So we've got it very clear that this person had to appear before the year 70, mentioned by the prophets, and the person was going to be killed, as mentioned by Daniel 9 and Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22. We could go on and on of all these predictions in the Old Testament that Jesus fulfilled, which also speaks to the truth.
That's right. Yeah, so he will come again, and he'll come again. The first time was for salvation of humanity. The second time is for judgment. So like right now, we live in the day of salvation. We live in a time period of grace, and God is very patient and he's waiting. And, I don't know how long it's going to take, but
nobody does.
Well, I keep on wondering, it's like, how much patience does God have?
I can't even imagine his patience because I can barely, I don't have any patience when I'm on Twitter. I can't even imagine. I can't take these people for 1 minute. I mean, some of these people. I want to go back to something that Lori said before on angels, because as you mentioned angels, I have never thought of that. And I really wanted to dig into that a little bit, because I think about what you mentioned. Now I think about the angel of the Lord appearing quite a few times in the Old Testament. I think about that the angel appeared to Daniel and gave him the prophecy in Daniel 9 of when Jesus would arrive in the Second Temple and all that kind of stuff. And the angel appeared to Mary and said she's blessed. Then the angels appeared at the tomb. And so, wow, I never even thought about the presence of angels. So did you want to speak a little bit more on that? Because I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I just loved that, because in each of the 4 gospels, there is an angelic presence, and every single time it confirms the resurrection. It confirms in fact, my favorite one is he says, he's not here. Why are you looking for him here? He's not here. He has risen, just as he said. So I just loved that the angelic presence was again communicating, being the liaison, the communicative liaison between God and the world. And they were simply pointing out, this is an event that's actually happened. He told you about it. This was not completely unexpected. Now, I realize that the disciples didn't necessarily connect with what was going on. They didn't necessarily understand that. But the angels were there to say, God is present. This is a work of God. He said it was going to happen. It did happen. And now we're here telling you it is finished. It is done. He has completed what he said he would do. And I think that's huge. God is trying so hard to help us understand that he's telling us the truth and we can count on what he says. So I love that too, SJ, that the angels were there basically saying the same thing, confirming if they were to have any doubts, because obviously we humans get confused pretty easily. We get self-deceived pretty easily. And so they were there to say, no, you're not deceiving yourselves. This actually happened.
Yeah, so that goes to show you that God uses the spiritual realm I was talking to you about earlier, about that there is a spiritual realm. God uses angels as messengers, and I know that a lot of people get into that whole angel worship stuff. And I'm not talking about that, but there is a definite spiritual realm that God uses. And so the angels were instrumental in being his messengers, and all throughout the scriptures. There's angels. So it is kind of cool. And I completely believe, that God still does that to this day, that he has angels and things, in the unseen realm. There is the unseen realm.
I agree with you. And in the book of Ephesians, Paul makes it clear that, or is it Hebrews? He says somewhere that angels will be around us. I forget which book it is. If it's Hebrews, I'm not sure who the author is, but we do know that was said.
Yeah,
John
I think you're
Lloyd,
right. And he even says we might entertain them unawares.
Right.
Yeah. I feel like I've met some people who I could say are angels. There's some really nice people out there. I would imagine a certain angelic presence in some ways. John Lloyd actually did another super chat, and thank you, John Lloyd. He said, Genesis and the fruit from the tree of knowledge, the symbolism with our brain. When we believe a lie seed, it can grow into neural pathways in our brain that resemble tree-like structures. So,
oh my gosh, that's pretty interesting.
Like a deep thought.
It is.
So,
well,
yeah, I think that's Jordan Peterson's made a lot of stuff about the book of Genesis and about all the symbolism in it. Mm-hmm. And it's what's really interesting about the Bible, besides the fact, of course, it was written over 1,500 years by 40 different authors, 40 or more authors, 3 continents, 3 languages. What's really cool about the Bible is its symbolism, and it's the fact that it can be read on a very low level. So someone with the least amount of intelligence or someone with a very deep amount of intelligence, both of them can look at the Bible and understand its message, but at different levels. And so I think that's super fascinating.
When I got saved, I was reading the Bible. I had an old King James version, and I'd never really cracked it because I couldn't understand it very well. And so I kind of just sat on my shelf and got dusty over the years. And then finally I met a guy in college who said, you need to get this other translation and don't start in book of Genesis. He says, read the book of John. And so I read the Gospel of John, and the first chapter of the Gospel of John, I got wrecked. I was wrecked. I mean, the Holy Spirit I just knew it was true. I just knew it was true. It was like that, that instinct or whatever, the gut feeling or whatever. And I wept openly about it because I just knew it was true. And so I think that, there is such a beauty to the scriptures, but there's also abuse And there's a lot of abuse to the scriptures, and lots of people take things out of context. They don't understand the author's intention when the author was writing it and what his audience was. And I think to really understand the scriptures well, we have to be really good students of history. We have to understand what it meant in the time it was written, and then we can pull it into our current cultural context. Because if you, like, a lot of people will complain, well, the Bible condones slavery or whatever, right? Well, you have to understand the times in which it was written and how things progressed. And slowly but surely through the Bible, there's a progressive movement toward more and more freedom. And as society got better and as we started recognizing things, there was a freedom in slavery, and to the point where, Paul then addresses one particular slave as his brother. Treat him as your brother. In other words, he's your equal. He's not less than. And there's also a progressive movement toward more and more freedom with women. And as the women, if you start reading the Bible and you start seeing how it progresses, by the time Christ comes, Christ has women disciples, maybe not in the 12, but in the 70 he does. And then he shows himself first to women. I mean, if that's not the ultimate validation of women, I don't know what is. That's the most important message anybody could bring, and he gave it to women to bring. So there's this progressive movement toward more and more freedom. But if you don't read the Bible, if you don't understand these kinds of things, and you just read it and read it like a novel, or you read it, with our modern mindset, that's why so many people get mad, and they don't understand the Old Testament. They go after God, as Richard Dawkins calls him, the moral monster or whatever. And it's like, because he doesn't understand, he doesn't get what was going on. He doesn't understand the overarching narrative of the Bible either. It's all about redemption. It's all about taking where people are and redeeming them to the better place. And if you start reading the Bible that way, then you start understanding God's heart behind it.
Have either of you read Nancy Pearcey's Finding Truth? Is it Finding Truth or Total Truth?
Yes, I've read one of her truth books. I forget what the title was, though.
Okay. Total Truth. I've read them both. I love Total Truth because that's actually what Lisa was just saying is one of the points. The redemption, typically as Christians, we think of redemption as an act, a personal act, something that happens in our lives individually, which is true. But the act of redemption, when we finally believe, when we finally understand who Jesus is, that God exists, and we accept what Jesus' work on the cross that he has done for us to bring us back into harmony, it really does create this whole redemptive act. Humanity was created good. He was created to be in harmony with God and in harmony with each other. Of course, sin came and wrecked everything. So this third kind of version, if you will, of humanity is the redemptive portion of God's program on planet Earth. And so we are progressively, like Lisa was saying, if we are growing in Christ likeness, we are progressively being redeemed. Right. And there is such beauty in that, because in fact, what we started out talking about, God as the moral authority sees all of us breaking his commandments and disregarding and treating each other poorly. And yet he doesn't just say, okay, I'm done with these people. He makes this incredibly large, beautiful, self-sacrificial act to bring us back to him, and then supervises and superintends our growth back into what we were always intended to be, with a mind and a heart that functions according to his love and his patience and his goodness, letting his character be formed in us. There is something so beautiful in that he's willing to overlook and to be patient with us, even when we fall and we stumble or we sleep in or we get tired or we get cranky. That does not dissuade him at all. He continues to work in us and make this possible for us. There's something so beautiful and rewarding in that. And I really do think people are selling it off too short to simply wipe it off as, oh, it's a fairy tale, oh, it's a myth, there's not enough evidence. There's plenty of evidence if you're willing to give the evidence a fair hearing. And if you do, you get invited into this wonderful, beautiful, restorative relationship with the creator of the cosmos. I mean, my gosh, what could be better than that?
I love that. I want to point out two comments in the chat that are related to that in a way. One of them is not as related, but it's really something I'm fired up about. But one of the things you guys mentioned is a lot of us get fired. Like if you feel like you're fired up about something that relates to God in some way, it's probably God giving you a sign that he wants you to look into this, whatever this is. And there's two things. The one thing I want to mention that I'm fired up about, but then I'll go to the other comment that somebody made, is I'm fired up about the book of Daniel. Like I am really fired up about its dating. And I don't know why. I don't have that background academically in that field. And it's bugging me because I see this stuff now. I started reading a lot of academic articles on this later dating thing. Somebody just said Daniel 8:25 is about, has to do with later dating in a way. So I need to go back and double check on Daniel 8:25 specifically, but I'm fired up about it. And I know that it's not normal the way I'm fired up about this, because I feel like it's a sign. But the other thing that somebody mentioned, Blaster Master said, he wants to know, I don't know if it's he or she, wants to know if, how do we reliably detect the unseen realm? What reliable method can we use to know that there is an unseen realm? What would you guys say to that?
So you go to the fruit of the Spirit, which is in Galatians. Help me out, you guys. Galatians something or other.
19 through 22.
Right.
Nice.
So the fruit of the Spirit, the good spiritual things are joy, peace, patience, kindness, love, all those kinds of things. That's actually spiritual. So those are the kinds of things that if you're feeling that and you're sensing that, that's the good stuff. But there's also a dark side to the spiritual realm. Those would be things that are life-taking. Those are dark things. Those are things that thoughts are of harm and hate, anger, those kinds of things. Those are, yes, they're emotions, but sometimes they're also played upon by the spiritual realm. So what I do is I always make sure that what I'm seeing or sensing lines up biblically.
Yeah.
So if there's again, the fruits of the Spirit are the way, just a lot of peace. Peace comes from God. Joy comes from God. Sort of a knowing, like there's like what SJ is experiencing with her passion about the book of Daniel. I think that that's probably God in her, the spiritual realm, drawing her into studying that more because he's giving her a passion for that. And so oftentimes God will direct our passions. It says, delight yourself in the Lord and he'll give you the desires of your heart. And so oftentimes when you start delighting yourself in the Lord, he changes the desires of your heart and he makes the desires of your heart become more in line with his ultimate purpose for you. Lori was mentioning that. It's like his ultimate purpose is redeeming us and pulling us into his dream for us. He has a dream for every single person on this planet. He has a dream for us. He sees our great potential. And I love that about God. That's one of the reasons why I think he tolerates us, is because not only do we have terrible potential to do terrible things, but we have this wonderful potential to become beautiful and all the things he's created us to be. And so let that guide you. Like let those kinds of things guide you toward goodness. If it's guiding you toward goodness and it lines up with the Bible, that's a good indication that it's probably a good spiritual thing that you're connecting to.
I think that's a great answer. That's awesome. Yeah. And so I think, and what are you two working on? What are you thinking about? Because as I said, I'm the book of Daniel's one. I feel like I'm called for two of them, two things I'm working on that I'm fired up about. One's objective morality. And what's really nice about that is I can work it into my academic studies. Like I'm doing a lot of studies on ethical decision-making that completely fit in for my field. And I love that. And I've got a sabbatical coming next spring and I'm really going to do a deep dive then.
Yeah.
The other one's the book of Daniel. But what do you think about that's super interesting that you're trying to learn more about now?
Well, so I feel like God's asking me to write a book, and it's going to take me probably years to write this. But when I got saved into a charismatic church. And so there was a lot of experiences with God, a lot of experiences with him. And so what I want to do is I want to write an apologetic on the experiences of God, because all the time we talk about the evidences of God, and we were talking about how subjective it is, that everyone has experiences and it's really hard to defend. So I feel like God's asking me to defend it, because I think that that's one area of apologetics that is kind of not looked at, because it is kind of subjective. And so, but what I want to do is I want to do research on exactly what are bona fide spiritual experiences. How do you know when you're connecting to God? How do you know that you, like some of my professors don't believe that you can be led by God. Like you're not, God gives you reasoning, but you can't really be led by him. I'm like, what do you mean? He can be led all the time. I mean, what do you think Abraham was led through there's all these instances of being led by the Spirit of God. So how did Abraham even hear that? How did he know he was supposed to go these places? And I think that's an untapped apologetic, because I feel like, look at the millions and millions and millions of people on this planet right now who have had experiences with God. I mean, SJ, you were just talking about your mom and your experience with God. And, when I got saved, I had a radical experience with God. And part of me doesn't really want to share that, to be honest with you, because I don't want to, it's like throwing your pearls to the swine. I don't want to, these are pearls, these are precious things to me that I had connected with God. It's like, do I want to just like put that out there and have people go, well, that's just blah, blah, blah. And they will too, man.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I really feel like that's an area that should be explored. So that's my passion right now.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I always say, people say, well, how would you empirically prove that God exists? What could you do? And I say, what I could do if I were so inclined is kind of similar to what you're saying. I could go sit outside of my church and interview a bunch of people. And then I could do subjective content analysis, which is a qualitative method that's empirical. And I could identify themes across all of these different people and their experiences. And that would be a great empirical way to give some evidence that God is working through these people.
I may have to talk to you.
Yeah, I mean, if you did interview people, I could help and analyze it. There's software that's out there that
oh my gosh, that would be great. I would love that.
Yeah, so
right.
That'd be fantastic. And both of you have had experiences. I've had. I mean, it's not like we're not unique. That's the thing. It's if I could go out there and I say I have this experience, or I've had multiple experiences, and I know I'm not alone. I'm not trying to claim I'm anything special. I'm definitely not. I'm way far from it. But if even I can have something happen, that's pretty big.
Right. And so there is a flip side to that. And it's the problem of divine hiddenness. So why do some people who are really maybe bona fidely trying to seek this, they don't experience anything, and so there's that too. So I want to explore that as well. So it's going to take me a while.
You see, I think on that, as far as divine hiddenness, I think that, and I know we're coming up on 1:30, we're coming up on kind of an hour and a half. So we're getting kind of, we might start breaking it out. But one thing I want to mention with that I think is important is God's not on our clock. Right. Like we can't just say, okay, God, appear to me now, or give me a sign. He might decide that we're not ready for that yet. And he might make us wait. And he made me wait 20 years. I mean, I had to it was a long time. And I was constantly reading like Deepak Chopra books and all these Eastern beliefs. And I thought that they were superior. I mean, I was way off base. I wasn't even sure if Jesus resurrected. I wasn't sure if he was my Lord. I was way out there. But I was still asking. I was like, okay, God, whatever form you're in, please give me a sign, just asking. I knew he was around. Like, I just knew there's a spiritual presence and something bigger than myself. But I couldn't, he wasn't giving me, like Jesus did not make himself known until a long time after I started asking. So, and I don't know how long it took for you guys, but that was at least my story.
Yeah. So Lori, do you have any things that God is laying on your heart to work on?
Yeah, a few. I'm working on an online course. Like I said, I'm trying to blend discipleship and apologetics. And so I'm working on something called the God Confidence Academy, because I want women, especially, to grow in their content, to grow in their discipleship and in their Christ-likeness, their transformation into the image of Christ, of course. But I also want to teach them kinds of things that have apologetic value for that purpose, such as like when you're learning about the design argument. Okay, there's obviously a very specific apologetic that there's a design in the universe and that points to a designer. So for us, when it comes to our devotional lives, what does that mean? How does that relate? Does that have any, does that have any substance there? And I really think it does, because that means it reminds me, the whole time we were studying the design argument, it reminds me of when I was pregnant with my kiddos and I would design their nurseries to be functional, to be beautiful. God has created this entire world for the purpose of putting life in it, which means that there wasn't one of us here on this planet. And I'm sure you're aware, especially as women, that there are an awful lot of people walking around who are seriously in doubt about their purpose, their worth, their value. Does anybody see me? Does anybody care about me? And God created this almost like a nursery, this entire cosmos for the purpose of sustaining life. Why did he do that? Because we are valuable. And that whole thing speaks to his purpose in allowing us to be created, his purpose in giving us meaning and something to accomplish on this earth before we leave, which, by the way, has eternal dividends, which has eternal purposes in mind. Every single day that we spend here, we can be investing in something eternal.
Amen.
that puts our worth way beyond this life and this experience and just the material aspects of our human existence. And so I want to try to link those as much as possible so that as women are studying the Bible and learning more about God and learning how to be obedient and how to study the scriptures and how to implement spiritual disciplines, they're also understanding that these apologetics that defend and that prop up and that point to the truth of God can be interwoven so that their faith in God becomes very secure and they can talk about it. They can expand not just their daily quiet time as far as having an effect on their personal life, which obviously it should, but also so that it can expand into a biblical worldview. I think a lot of us get too touchy-feely, too narrow in our personal quiet times or our church experience or our Bible studies. And we don't take the time to stop and consider, okay, what does that mean on a larger scale? If this theological doctrine, let's say, is true, then how does that play out in the bigger context of how I raise my family, how I conduct my marriage, how I conduct my business? How do I see my work and my vocation from a distinctly Christian perspective? I think those are really important things. And I come to them because I think I'm drawn to them because as a young woman, I was just aimless in that department. And I think young women especially are in such a decision heavy period of life. Who am I going to marry? What am I going to study? What job am I going to do? How do I raise my children once I have them? When do I have them? How do I raise them? These are so important, such important considerations, and we need to do it from a holistic, robust Christian perspective. And I don't think that there's the tendency for us as individuals in our individual walks with Christ to be quite that broad in our thinking. And so that's kind of the gap I'm trying to fill. Along with, I also love, like SJ, I love the 3 M's, mind, meaning, and morality. I love those and how those point to God. And also I'm very fascinated with the dilemma that we're seeing in science that they can't quite explain how information was input into the system to create life. And I think biological information is also pointing to the existence of God. So things like that. I'm really excited about things like that and hoping to kind of work through those this year.
I love that. And that reminds me of DNA code. I've got a chat coming up next Monday with Cy Gart, who's a biochemist. He is going to debate about is DNA code with another guy who's insistent that DNA is not code. And Cy has already pulled out his biology textbooks to show me it's like they say DNA is code. That's what's fascinating. If you've got this very complex code, where did that come from with no coder?
Right.
And so, we see that. I've got a couple questions coming in. I want to say somebody was asking if our feelings relate to God. And then Mike Winter saying, is Lori saying that all the billions of light years of space are here to support us on this planet? Before I go there, I want to comment on that really quickly. Hugh Ross has written some amazing stuff on the odds again, that Earth has overcome and the habitable zones that we're in that are unlike any other planet by a landslide. And so I really recommend people take a look at what Hugh Ross has written because it'll kind of blow you away. But the other thing as far as feelings and Jesus did something in the Bible that I think is really important for people. You first have to have this little bit of faith. And as Martin Luther King once said, I think you have to get on that first step up the ladder to God. Just have a little teeny bit of faith and then see what happens. And he did this example where his disciples didn't really have much faith. They'd been fishing all day. They weren't catching any fish. And he said, well, just throw the net over there. It's like, hey, just trust me on this. Just throw the net over there. They're, oh man, we're so tired. Haven't caught anything. So they throw the net in the water and they end up like catching 153 fish, I think it was. And so that's all you got to do. A little bit of faith to start and then see what happens.
That's right.
Yeah. So, okay. So what I want to do now, Lisa, you've got a site called Think Divinely. And Lori, you just mentioned this God Confidence Academy. I need to get links to all that stuff so I can put them in the description so people can get to you guys and find your information that you're giving. And I think it's super valuable. I really love the fact that you're on here. Just to throw a plug out too, I rarely get females on female apologists because we're few and far between if you look at the numbers in the books and all that kind of stuff. So it's amazing to see peers of mine doing this kind of great work. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having us on today. It was really, really fun.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
So,
I always love these conversations, and I think we should do this more often. I think we should be more regular, and maybe we could kind of work through some of these topics, you know, individually, and then come discuss them in regular intervals. That might be a really great thing for all of us.
I think so. Maybe we can get a regular time, because I think that that's one of the ways that these channels, like I think you both have channels. We could go and rotate around each other's channels too.
I don't really have a channel. So, I mean, Women in Apologetics is going to be more of a interviewing format. It won't be like a taped discussion format. So, but I'll go on your guys' channel.
Okay. Yeah,
yeah,
so we can go back and forth, maybe every couple of weeks or something.
Sure, I totally appreciate the opportunity, and it is my heart, I think, to come from a female perspective, because I think we have a unique perspective, and I think that it's important to, you know, hear both sides, you know, the male side and the female side, because I think they make a complete whole. So.
Yeah, I think they do. And I think that's a great point. Jordan Peterson a lot of times talks about male and female differences, and a lot of people try to downplay our differences, but I think we should capitalize on the fact, for example, that females are more nurturing, and take advantage of how we can use that nurturing, our nurturing sense, to bring others to Christ.
That's right. I agree 100%.
So, well, great. Well, thank you guys. I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. So just stick around for just a second. So here we go.
Okay. God bless you guys.
Everybody who came in here
Thanks for
today.
watching.